Speaker, today on behalf of the Greens, I'm introducing the Residential Tenancies Act Amendment Rent Freeze Bill 2023 to freeze rents for 2 years and to put a stop on out-of-control rent increases. New South Wales is in a rental crisis, a crisis the likes of which we have not seen in generations. Rents are increasing 4 times faster than wages, evictions are on the rise, and too many renters are just one rent hike away from homelessness. The New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties, its Council for Social Services this week estimated, based on census data analysis, that 1 in 5 renters in New South Wales are living in poverty. We are introducing this bill as the Greens because the crisis renters are now in right now requires immediate action to address the skyrocketing rents. And before anyone starts saying we are making renting fairer and we're appointing a rental commissioner and we have a broader suite of reforms in place and planned, can I make it clear that none of the reforms that are on the table right now from the new Labor-Minns government will provide any cost of living rental relief for the crisis that renters are facing at this time. This is a crisis that requires an urgent response, and I would urge all members to think about this and the stories that they have heard from people living in their communities who have been subjected to massive rent hikes, who are living below the poverty line, who are living in housing stress and paying well over 30% of their income on rent, and to think on whether they can really face looking at those people in their electorates, in their communities, and look them in their eye if they do not support this rent freeze bill. Because it would give renters the desperately needed relief that they need for ongoing stress and worry about the rent hikes and evictions that they are facing. We all have the power in this chamber to act right now to make this change, to give the urgent relief to renters in our communities experiencing enormous financial stress, and all we have to do in this chamber is vote for it. The Residential Tenancies Amendment Rent Freeze Bill 2023 will prohibit rent increases for all residential tenancies agreements in New South Wales for 2 years. Under Section 40A(3) of the bill, all New South Wales residential tenancies rents will be frozen at their rate as of the 30th of June 2023. If a new tenant starts a lease at a property after that date, the property can only be rented at or below the June 2023 rate. If a property was not rented out on the 30th of June 2023, then during the rent freeze period of 2 years, it can only be rented out under a new tenancy agreement at or below the median rent for that postcode. These provisions, freezing rents as of tomorrow, the 30th of June 2023, and linking it to the property rather than to the tenant, ensures that we will not see a massive rent hike before the bill is enacted, nor an increase in unfair no-grounds evictions as a way for dodgy landlords to avoid this freeze. The rent freeze is linked to the property and not to an individual tenant or lease agreement. Section 40A(4)(a) of the bill also provides a maximum penalty for breaching the rent freeze at 50 penalty units for an individual or 100 penalty units for others. These penalties are in line with the government's recently passed Residential Tenancies Amendment Rental Fairness Bill and are appropriately balanced against the significant profits that are to be made in the private rental market. Section 229 of the bill sets out the requirement for the Minister to ensure review of Section 40A is conducted within 1 year of the section commencing. A report on the outcome of the review must be tabled in each House of Parliament no later than 6 months after the review is carried out, and it is envisaged that the soon-to-be appointed Rental Commissioner would be best placed to conduct this review. The legislation sets out that this review must consider 3 elements. First, whether the policy objectives of the section remain valid, that is, the 2-year rent freeze. Second, whether the terms remain appropriate for securing the objectives of the bill. And most significantly, the need to consider whether ongoing limits to rent increases are required to ensure rents remain and are affordable. This will give Parliament the time to consider the impacts of this temporary 2-year rent freeze that this bill will introduce, as well as any longer ongoing actions required to ensure rents are affordable, including considering the introduction of limits on rent increases and making it illegal for unlimited rent increases to be imposed on renters in New South Wales. To be clear, this bill does not do that. At this point, what we are doing is simply introducing an interim 2-year rent freeze so that we have time to reform our rental laws in this state and deal with this crisis. I want to take time to respond directly to some of the comments made by the Premier and others expressing their concerns and opposition to a rent freeze, because I believe in drafting this legislation, we have shifted and changed the original drafting to address these concerns and that they have now all been addressed. We have heard concern that somehow freezing rent increases will actually increase rent prices, suggesting that landlords and real estate agents will jack up rents in anticipation or at the end of the rent freeze period. While this is a clear admission of what the Greens know to be true, that dodgy landlords and real estate agents are price gouging and profiting off the housing crisis from poor renters right now, we share the concerns that the desire for those who wish to profit out of the housing crisis will stop at nothing to boost their bottom line, and that is why the bill includes a number of safeguards to ensure that this does not happen. Section 40A 3B of the bill ensures that the rent freeze isn't just linked to the individual tenancy agreement and is set in place regardless of whether a tenancy ends at that property to act as a safeguard against potential eviction for the purpose of the landlord trying to seek to avoid the freeze. The 30 June 23 commencement date also ensures that landlords cannot preemptively increase rents ahead of the rent freeze period, with Section 40A2 clearly stipulating that rent increases after this date would have absolutely no effect. Speaker, the review required under the bill also ensures consideration be given as to whether the ongoing limit on rent increases are required to ensure rents are affordable. And I will be clear, on behalf of the Greens today, this bill is intended, as it is outlined, as an interim emergency measure. To get rents under control, we need much bigger and longer-term reforms. But we also know that renters are struggling now, and a 2-year rent freeze gives this new government the time and space to implement the reforms that they believe will actually address the crisis. During the 24-month rent freeze period, we expect to work working hard in here and campaigning on the streets out there to ensure that this government is taking the necessary action to put an end to no grounds evictions and to implement long-term solutions that will get the cost of rents under control. That is what the government's job is, and we are willing to work with them to do that. The Greens are here to offer solutions when it comes to addressing the housing affordability crisis, to make renting secure and fairer, but we recognise also that fairness is not enough. We need to ensure that renting is also genuinely affordable and not putting people in financial stress. We have also repeatedly heard, sadly, outdated and irrelevant studies rolled out to justify inaction and opposition to a rent freeze. Studies that do not take into account the scale of the crisis that we are facing at this present time or reflect the temporary nature of the Greens' proposed rent freeze. They also misrepresent arguments about supply in a way that shamefully but unsurprisingly works in a benefit way to big investors and those profiting from the current crisis. One of the clearest examples that we can point to is Berlin, where in 2019, residential rents were frozen on apartments built before 2014. The sky did not fall in, and neither did supply. Instead, as economist Dr. Cameron Murray wrote in The Guardian last week, Berlin saw considerably faster new housing development than the 13 next largest German cities in the 2 years following the introduction of that policy. We have also heard claims that in a rent-controlled market, investors will simply pull their investment properties off the market. Not only is there no evidence to back up this claim, but the reality of the housing crisis we are in means that many renters actually would love to buy their first home, but have instead been locked out of an ever-increasing house prices, but no small part because big investors have access to more borrowing power and are hoarding properties. If landlords have no interest in participating in a rental market that doesn't fleece renters, they can simply sell their investment properties and create the opportunity for first home buyers while also reducing the demand in the private rental market. And before we start hearing cries of panic of the loss of rental supply, the Greens have a very simple solution to put forward as to how we tackle that crisis. Simply by building more public housing and not demolishing the existing stock that is there, and by putting in place a requirement as of now that 30% genuinely affordable housing be included in all new development in New South Wales from now. But instead of actually implementing these solutions, too often we hear blames and excuses. We hear that the intervention is simply not possible. And whether it's the NIMBYs, the migrants, the wealthy overseas investors, the international students, or the local councils, every week it seems that governments are more interested in finding someone else to blame in a headline than they are about stepping up to solve the actual housing crisis. Well, instead of playing the blame game when it comes to the rental crisis, the New South Wales government could act right now, and in this chamber, when we come back from our winter break, we could pass rent freezes for the people of New South Wales. Because everything is impossible until it is not. And all we need is the willingness and the political will in this chamber to provide financial relief to the 2 million plus renters that live in this state. An unprecedented crisis we are facing right now, and governments need to take necessary actions and interventions to address the material and make a material difference in people's lives. During the pandemic, we saw the federal government double the rate of job seeker and lift more than 1 million people out of poverty. I don't think any of us would have predicted that would happen under a Liberal national government. Here in New South Wales, in this very parliament, in the peak of the COVID pandemic, we froze rents on commercial tenancies for 6 months and put in place a moratorium on evictions for residential tenants under the Retail and Other Commercial Leases COVID-19 Regulation 2020. It was an emergency and we acted accordingly. While in Victoria, all rents, residential and commercial, were frozen during that pandemic period for 6 months, alongside a ban on evictions under the COVID-19 Omnibus Emergency Measures Act 2020. And just last December, after we had adjourned for the year, New South Wales Parliament was urgently recalled to this chamber, well, in fact, a bizarre room on the side, was recalled to take urgent action to pass laws to cap coal and gas prices so that we could reduce electricity bills for people facing escalating cost of living pressures. This is the responsibility that government has, to take urgent action and intervention when there is a crisis to address the unprecedented financial stress that people are facing. Well, the rental crisis that people are facing in this state is clearly unprecedented. With no limit on rental increases, rents in Sydney have surged by 20% over the last 12 months and by 6.7% in regional areas in New South Wales, according to the Tenants Union New South Wales Rent Tracker data. Rentals in New South Wales are sitting at unprecedented levels of unaffordability. More and more people are experiencing severe rental stress, and there is a dire shortage of rentals that are affordable for people on low incomes. Just this week, the Tenants Union of New South Wales, Shelter New South Wales, the New South Wales Council of Social Services, and the Housing Action for the Aged Group jointly demanded that the government act on out-of-control rents. And I quote, "Too many are spending too much of their income on rent, leaving too little for other necessary expenses. The escalating cost of housing has placed a tremendous burden on individuals and families. Together, we draw attention to the urgency of addressing the problem of increasing rents. The New South Wales government needs to provide clear plans to address the pricing of this essential service to bring it in line with community needs and expectations." Well, I have good news today, because this bill would do just that. It is not the only solution, but it is the start of a solution. This bill would give renters immediate relief and would cost nothing to the government's budget bottom line. It is a cost of living measure much more significant in scale to the weekly budget impact from the Active Kids voucher, and it is a much bigger impact than toll rebates or energy caps, and it won't cost Treasury a single cent. Every day the government refuses to act is another day that a renter will face eviction because of an unfair rent hike they can't afford. The Greens know that a rent freeze alone is not going to solve the housing crisis. It's the start, not the end, of ongoing, desperately needed reform to put a stop to the massive profits big investors and developers are reaping from the housing crisis and make renting more affordable and secure. We look forward to the commitments that this government has made to end unfair no-grounds evictions and appoint a rental commissioner and provide much greater transparency and oversight in the rental market. We believe that unlimited rent increases can and should be illegal, whether it's through rent caps similar in the ACT, the only state in the country right now that has seen the cost of rent actually go down, by capping rent increases to 2% a year, or by establishing an independent body to be able to set and regulate rents. The Greens want long-term measures to get rents under control, but we also know that we need to address the short-term and holiday renting issues in our communities, and that there is a real need to address the hotspots where families and local workers are finding it nearly impossible to find affordable renters where they live. It is why the Greens are committed to cracking down on the profit motive underpinning the housing crisis, making those profiting from short-term rentals pay tax just like any other business, and empowering local councils to set short-term rental caps and limits as they see fit, and as well imposing a 5% at least tax on empty homes across the state. But we also need viable alternatives to the private housing system that we know is so broken. We need a massive investment in public housing. Australia is one of the most privatised housing markets anywhere in the world. By stepping up and making this a government responsibility, we can improve conditions, incentivise lower rents, and ensure better living standards for private renters. If public housing is good, cheap, and plentiful, private landlords have to offer something better to remain competitive in the market. The state has a role to play. So today, the Greens are clear. We are here to work with this government to make renting more secure, more affordable, that there are many mechanisms and levers and policy reforms and new initiatives that can solve this crisis. We know the solutions are all there and that this is just one small part. But we also know that renters can't handle the financial stress any longer and that they need urgent relief while the rest is being worked out. The New South Wales government, and indeed every member of this parliament, this minority government, has a choice. They can stand on the side of big investors and developers, or they can relieve renters from the soaring rents by supporting the Greens rent freeze bill that I'm introducing today, to work with us to implement longer-term solutions to the rental and housing crisis. It is time for this chamber to listen to the 60% of people who, in a recent Guardian Essential poll, found support for freezing rental increases, which back in this bill. A freeze on rents isn't only possible, it is urgently necessary, and we in this parliament have the power to do it. The time for blame is over, the time for action is here. I commend the bill to the House.